there was one little thing I heard on the radio when I was a kid that stayed with me my whole life. There's a meteorologist on the radio who was being asked a tough question, and he said back to the news broadcaster, he said, look, forecasting is an art and a science, and that's not what I'm doing here. That's not what I do on the radio. He said, what I do is describe to you problems that are already happening right now. I give you an analysis of events now as they're unfolding. And that's completely different from forecasting. That's completely different from predicting how much rain will there be in the next 12 months or in the next 6 years, or, how well is the wheat crop going to do? I mean, weather forecasting for farming can be very, very serious business, right? He says, no. What I'm doing right now on this radio program, I'm telling you about a storm, or I'm telling you about a hurricane. It's happening right now. We have satellite images right now. I'm giving you analysis of reality as it unfolds right now. That's very, very different. It's different from forecasting. Okay? People ask me all the time, should they learn Chinese? Two different people talked to me about this today. From the year 2020 to the year 2040, if we're talking about the immediate future, in my lifetime, in your lifetime, yes, right now is the time to learn Chinese as a language as never before. I got sympathy for other languages. I have interest in other languages. Historical interest, academic interest, scholarly interest. There are fascinating languages in India, okay? And you know what? Maybe in the next 200 years, India is also going to be of this kind of immense political, cultural, and economic importance. But right now, not forecasting, talking about the reality right now as it's unfolding. Right now, the opportunity is Chinese. Chinese is the language to learn. Whether you are in California or New York City or Hong Kong or Taiwan or Athens, Greece, wherever you are in Europe or Africa or South America, right now, Chinese is the language to learn. So I got Melissa on the wire here. I got Melissa on the phone. And your perspective on this is a little bit different just because you have to deal with a different kind of skepticism in your life, right?
Yes, I've had people in my life ask me, why are you studying Chinese? How could this possibly lead to career opportunities? Opportunities for employment, opportunities for earning money.
But so these same people, like, okay, the Chinese language is so iconic, it's instantly recognizable. Don't you see Chinese? Don't you see the writing on the wall, as we say in English? Don't you see it on neon signs in Los Angeles, in New York City, in London, England? Don't you see it everywhere? Don't you hear about China on the news every night? You know what I mean? I'm like keeping it really shallow, talking about ordinary people, not people who are specialists or scholars or something. Don't they have some sense of the enormous, unique importance of China in the world right now and in the immediate future?
One would think, but sometimes I don't talk to people who are very
But look, I got all the sympathy in the world for Bangladesh. I got all the sympathy in the world for the Tamils. These are important language. I have all the sympathy in the world for people who make the commitment to learn a tiny language with a small number of speakers, like Irish, Irish Gaelic, or Cree or Ojibwe. Those are very, very different kinds of commitments to make. It's a very, very different kind of argument to ask, are you the right person to commit to studying this language? But I mean, right now, 2020, Chinese, I really feel the writing is on the wall. It's completely obvious. You and I were in Athens, Greece together. We didn't talk to that many people. But you remember I talked to the owner of that bookstore, and that guy just didn't get it. So this guy owns a bookstore. He speaks good English. I could say like 10 words in Greek, My ability in Greek was almost zero, but I was studying before I went over. Talking to this guy in English, and I'm really trying to let him know, look, you need to start carrying books for people learning Chinese. Athens, the Piraeus harbor, the famous ancient harbor of Athens, is now owned by the Chinese. This is the place where China meets Europe. This is where all of the industry and all of the shipping, and they had just announced a whole long list of new institutions to be built. This is where, Chinese people are going to be learning Greek, and Greek people are going to be learning Chinese as never before. And there are billions of dollars involved and all kinds of opportunities. And guess what? Do a little bit of math. Compare the total population of Greece to the total population of China. The influence China has on Greece is going to be so much bigger than the influence Greece has in China. And that guy, he just didn't get it. I mean, you remember his reaction?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, when I went to the airport, the man who drove me to the airport in the taxi, he was talking about how basically the rental properties has now grown to become such a huge source of Chinese immigrants.
Right.
That most of the property is owned by people of Chinese descent.
Right.
And so I do think that people there generally do see the influx of Chinese population.
Right.
So it makes sense that you'd want to have more language learning.
And it takes
in a bookstore.
It takes less than 0.5% of China to totally transform Greece forever. And that partnership is very real and ongoing, and it's exploding right now. Not just economically, not just politically, but yes, including economically and politically. So really briefly, this phone call with my girlfriend, it's inspired by the fact that I had a conversation with an old friend the two of us have had for several years. And this old friend of mine was at first asking me whether or not he should learn Japanese. And then, long story short, I started talking to him about Japanese, French, and several other languages, and asking him, well, why are you considering learning another language at all? What's motivating you to take on another language? And he gave me a complex answer that I think is true of many people who are, as grown adults thinking about making a serious commitment to another language. That included, wanting to branch out intellectually, wanting to have a more fulfilling life emotionally. But yes, there is a huge component here, which is just an economic concern. He's concerned about his own employability in the future. He's concerned about how much of the map of planet Earth he's really going to have access to for the rest of his life, so on and so forth. So there was a big fear of being economically marginalized and wanting to learn a language for that reason. And, I just said to him, well, look, if this is what we're talking about, Chinese is the language for you to learn. There is no comparison to Japanese. Now, babe, sorry, I'm going to keep talking for a minute, but babe, I think you don't see this side of Western culture. There's this whole discourse we're obsessed with the decline of the Roman Empire. And when you use the word decline, people assume it means something it really doesn't mean. Decline doesn't mean that Rome completely burned down and disappeared. Okay, Rome is still there. But Japan right now is in decline. Okay, beautiful country, great place to go on vacation. They have democracy and freedom of speech, high quality of life, good health care, very low crime rate. A lot of great things to say about Japan, and none of those things are true of China. Communist China is not a democracy, don't have a low crime rate, okay? Guess what? Japan is in decline. Well, maybe you're planning to live forever. Whoever you are watching this in the audience, maybe you're planning to live another 100 years. I'm worried about the next 20 years. I've got to live for today. I've got to live for now, okay? In the next 20 years, Japan is in decline, and it is going to continue to be in decline. The significance of the Japanese language, even within Japan and internationally, is going to continue to decline. Speaking Japanese is not important or useful in Paris, London, Berlin, Los Angeles, or New York City. It's not. And 20 years from now, that trend is going to continue. Japan will become less and less significant. Okay? A lot of wonderful things about Japan, but that is the truth. Japan is in decline. There's no comparison to Chinese. Chinese is already a tremendously important language in Los Angeles, London, Paris, Berlin, New York City, right? It already is. And 20 years from now, it is only going to be more so. I have all kinds of sympathy for the people of India and the politics of India and the languages of India. Within 20 years, that is not a prediction I can make. And there is no other language, there is no other culture, there is no other political discourse that is, in terms of scale and depth, can compete with China. Can even be compared to Chinese as a language. I got love for France, I got love for French culture and French people, and I have my own reasons to be motivated to learn French. In the next 20 years, to talk about learning French being attached to some kind of opportunity, the opportunities attached to the French language would be trivial, just no comparison compared to what learning Chinese means now and what it's going to mean in the immediate future. Tell me what you feel, babe. You got to ask yourself these questions too. You got to ask yourself these questions for your own motivation. Go.
Yeah, I do ask myself that, and especially if I'm trying to explain why I would be learning Chinese, these do come up in my considerations. For me, it's more, it is interesting to hear what you said, that Muhammad seems to be wanting to branch out intellectually, and that's why he's interested in learning Japanese. For me, it also plays that role in my life, wanting to have something meaningful, like an area of scholarship that, for me, I can excel in. I seem to be naturally fairly talented at learning Chinese. So yeah, for me, that it's more of like a personal reason than an economic or business reason.
Right.
However, I do think when I speak to people about it, that tends to be what I rely on, because I think that's more like an actual thing that I can rely on, like
you
something
talk
more solid. Yeah.
Okay. You talk about the way it's meaningful to you, or you talk about the economic? What do you? I just didn't catch which one you said.
No, I tend to talk about the economic side.
Oh, okay.
Because for me, I feel like that is what more people would say would justify my learning Chinese.
Well, okay. Something I said to him that surprised me slightly. I surprised myself a little bit. I said to him, look, when you're thinking about learning a language, you have to ask yourself a little bit, is this language interesting to me in itself? Like, am I interested in this history, this culture? Am I interested in the politics that are unfolding now, in and of itself? Or am I only interested in it in connection to other things as a means to something else, right? And I said to him, look, I used to study Japanese, right? Japan is interesting. Japan is fascinating to me, right? But only as it's connected to other things. And I think this also does relate to the nature of the economic opportunity, really. Like, what's interesting? Japan's role in World War II. But that's not Japan. Right? Japan's role in the Russian Revolution. Did research on that. You guys might not know, but that's not Japan, right? That's Japan's connection to Russia, to outside history. You know what's interesting? What's interesting is how a whole bunch of really important European texts, including like European philosophy, were first translated into Japanese and then went from Japanese into Chinese, and how this totally transformed Chinese culture. How Japan reinterpreted European culture and science and technology, and then the rest of Asia got influenced by it. That's interesting, okay? All that's interesting to me. But Japan in itself, of itself, for itself, I'm not really interested in Japan. And briefly to flip that around, I think a lot of Japanese people, if they're studying World War I, they might be interested in Canada's role in World War I. I think if they're studying World War II, they're interested in Canada's role in World War II, but they're not really interested in Canada. That's fine. I'm Canadian, I'm not insulted. But it's just, I think you really have to be honest with yourself about that. And let me tell you something. China is interesting to me for China. Like, Chinese politics matter when they have no connection to the outside world. When we're just talking about China, Chinese history, going back 2,000 years or more, whatever you want to say for that. If I were really Chinese, I'd say 5,000 years. They always want to make it. We don't really have 5,000 years of history to work with. But anyway, getting into fragments of pottery from 5,000 years ago, right? But anyway, however many thousand years, and current and ongoing, China, is interesting and rewarding and important economically, politically, and in every other way. Sure, just as China. So for me, I think that's something you have to kind of examine yourself. You have to consider your own feelings. You have to come to your own conclusions about that.
Yeah, right. I did not grow up in a big city. I did not grow up in New York. I did not grow up around Los Angeles, and I didn't actually see any of those very big cities for my adult life. So I just say, I don't know if I ever told you this, but surprisingly, I actually did take Japanese classes when I was in elementary school.
I think you never mentioned that before. That's really, I think you never mentioned that before. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so my elementary school had these after class programs, and Japanese was one of them. So I think for a year or two, I did learn a little bit of Japanese. Of course, I've forgotten all of it.
Yeah.
But at that time, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is when I was in high school, I felt that the languages that were on offer for me to learn were French, German, and Spanish. And a lot of the emphasis was on Spanish, just because in America so many people are bilingual with Spanish.
Yep.
And there tends to be this push to learn Spanish, at least in my family. They said that's the future. That's where the economic opportunity is in America, is learning Spanish.
Just pause for 1 second. Think about how demented that is. Think about how ridiculous that seems now in 2020. Think about how ridiculous it is to say to a kid, the future economic opportunity is in Mexico. And if you didn't mean Mexico, do you actually mean that the future economic opportunity is in Spain? Spain went completely bankrupt during our lifetime. Just a few years ago, they were in a state of total economic crisis, total economic collapse. One of the most extreme economic collapses in history. They had more than 25% unemployment, right? I want you to continue, but what could be more ridiculous than saying to a kid, the future is Mexico, or the future is Spanish even? Again, I'm not talking about 100 years or 200 years. I'm living for today. I mean the next 10 years. I mean the next 20 years. I've got to make it happen now, because I don't have 200 years to live. Sorry, go on, babe. Great.
Right. So when I think about that time where I was learning Japanese just after school, how would I have continued studying that?
Yeah.
My parents would have had to be motivated to say, hey, Melissa, the future is Japanese. You should learn Japanese, and we're going to get you a private tutor or something.
One way or another, it would be 100% on your parents. Yep. Go on.
Yeah. So I just think, where I grew up, there was no focus on Asian languages. And even, I know we met somebody in the airport at Beijing, in Beijing airport, who said that Chinese was not offered at his high school, so he had to, get a private tutor.
Of course.
I think things are changing, and more you'd be able to learn an Asian language in America. It definitely depends on where you live.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's more normal for students who grew up in New York to study an Asian language in high school. But I just thought of German culture, French culture, Spanish culture as not so foreign. But, then I had this experience of living in China with you and getting accustomed to the language, familiar with how to, how to survive in China, and learning more about the history. It just, grew over time to be something that I do have an interest in. I do have an interest in China, like you say. I mean, like you were talking about with, an interest in Japan in terms of World War II is how they're interacting with other countries, with other.
Well, when I was a little kid in Toronto, sorry, go on. Do you have some more?
No.
When I was a little kid in Toronto, you saw my neighborhood, but that same neighborhood, when I was a kid, it had quite a few Jamaican shops. I think there were still a couple when we were there, but anyway, Neighborhoods change that way over as the decades come and go. And, I said to my parents one day, I was a little kid, I said, do you realize that Jamaica is a much smaller country than China? And my father laughed. He was like, yes, of course, Jamaica's only a small island. And I said, well, I said basically, I thought Jamaica and China were countries of equal size and equal importance, like equal population, because growing up in that neighborhood, again, Chinese was very prominent. You saw the Chinese language. I mean, you can recognize, even if you don't know any Chinese, it just aesthetically and graphically looks different. You know when you're looking at a Chinese restaurant or a restaurant with a sign in Chinese. It's obvious, yes. Right? Mm-hmm. So that neighborhood, there was a very big Chinese presence, but then there was an equally large Jamaican presence. So in terms of what you're saying, like how we grow up perceiving one language as important or one country as important, again, it is partly political, it is partly cultural, so on and so forth. But okay, now we're adults. Now we've got to make some decisions. Within my lifetime, so I'm 41 years old. When I was a kid, Singapore spoke a totally different language from mainland China, right? Hong Kong spoke a totally different language from mainland China, right? The level of language diversity and mutual incomprehension within China was way higher than it is now, okay? Today, and in the next 20 years, as never before, all of the Chinese people are united by a common language, especially a common written language, but even so, the spoken language being, okay? Yeah. That's not true of India. That could change in future, okay? That could change 50 years from now or something. But again, today, part of the power and depth of what's going on with the Chinese language and Chinese political discourse is that this is one language that reaches over 1 billion people. And again, when I was a kid, that really wasn't true. I mean, the government of Singapore had a massive program to try to educate Singaporeans to speak, read, and understand standard Chinese. They really didn't 40 years ago. It's a story not worth telling, right? And now within China, province by province, city by city, it's a different story in different places. But of course, it's partly the influence of television and the internet and all these other things. Chinese has emerged within China as this mega language. And look, I used to study the Cree language. There is no ancient literature in Cree. I literally owned or got out of the library every single book ever printed in the Cree language. All of them, Sorry, it's a small language spoken by a small number of people. It doesn't have 2,000 years of literature. It doesn't have
2,000 years. I mean, it does
right.
have the history.
Right, but you can't,
written,
right.
It's not,
it doesn't exist on paper.
It's not in an accessible form where you can learn about it. I mean, other than what you read from Christian,
right.
Basically the colonizers who
right.
everything for them, and it's a very tragic history. It's very sad.
Right.
I mean, I definitely, have a
right.
lot of interest in that. But in terms of what is the future, you've had the experience of learning all these different languages. I mean, you have the experience of saying, okay, no, I don't think Korean Ojibwe is the future. Generally, speaking, if I speak to somebody, who lives in Europe, who wants to learn another language, of course, you're not going to recommend, hey, you should learn Korean Ojibwe. And if you're thinking on a global scale, you're definitely going to be more focused on the Chinese.
Sure.
It's a no-brainer. But.
Right. But I think that's why this conversation with Muhammad kind of got me out of my comfort zone, is because normally I'm giving advice to really scholarly people for really scholarly reasons. For the right person, learning Korean Ojibwe is a great idea. Like, it could be good for you in specific as one specific person. And I meet and talk to those people. I talk to very unusual people in universities who are learning languages for unreasonable reasons, for very, very rare and unusual reasons. It could be part of a meaningful life, and you could do really meaningful humanitarian work, and you could be part of a really meaningful research project in anthropology or whatever it is. Okay? I mean, I've asked this question all the time on YouTube. If not you, then who? Are you the right person to take this on? Maybe you are as an individual. But it's really rare that I deal with that kind of general question for an ordinary person that Muhammad was putting to me. And again, he's a guy who already knows Arabic, English, and German. So for him to learn French would be 1% of the work of learning Japanese. But here's another comparison. Here's another comparison. For him to learn Persian, for him to learn the languages of Iran would be 1%. Or okay, maybe 5% of the work, right? Because he already knows Arabic. So learning Persian, it's a different language. I'm not going to digress into the differences and similarities, okay? But still, okay, it would be much easier for him to learn Persian than to learn Japanese and Chinese, right? But now think about it. Intellectually, emotionally, personally, politically, and economically, in the next 20 years, there is no comparison between Chinese and Persian, between China and Iran, and there's no comparison between China and France either. So there you go, guys. For once, from this channel, reckless optimism, reckless encouragement. Right now, 2020, is the time to learn Chinese as never before.